Our gospel reading this morning comes to us from the gospel according to Matthew, the second chapter, verses 1 through 12. If you'd like to follow along in your pew Bibles, I would invite you to do so at this time. It's in the New Testament on page 783. Let's all listen for God's word to us today. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea. For so it has been written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel.'" Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. The word of the Lord. Let me invite you as we begin this morning, in fact, as we begin this new year together, let me invite you to think for a bit about your relationship with darkness. Now, I realize as soon as I say that, some, many, maybe all of you didn't realize you had a relationship with darkness, but you do. We all do. Is anybody here afraid of the dark? Or maybe there are some here who make a point not to go out driving after the sun goes down because it is not safe, it is just too dark. Or perhaps there are some of you who really enjoy camping, and your favorite moment when you are camping is on a summer night when it's all clear and there are no city lights nearby, and you can see up and look at the stars that are so visible in the sky, because it is dark. Have you ever given any thought to what darkness does to you? Darkness is a pretty powerful thing. One thing it can do is narrow our vision and stoke our fears. For example, I recall the time back when my family lived in Dallas and we were having some trouble with rats in our yard. So we got some rat traps with poisoned food in them, hoping that would take care of the rats. Well, one night I was letting our dog out in the backyard, and the dog froze and started barking. And I saw these two eyes staring back at me in the night from one of our crepe myrtle trees. Then those eyes moved, and this grayish creature, yay big with a long tail, ran from the tree along the fence to another tree. I ran inside the house. I said to my wife, "Come on outside. You have got to see the size of this rat. Should I get a shovel? Where's the shovel?" And I went off looking for the shovel. Well, my wife and the dog go out into the backyard, and we meet next to the garage, and she says, "Honey, you know that shovel you're holding like a lightsaber right now? Please don't use it. That's a possum, not a rat that you saw." Have you ever thought about what darkness does to you? Darkness is a pretty powerful thing, and yet it does not have to be a disabling thing. I read a few years ago about how the great cellist Yo-Yo Ma used to play, maybe he still does, a Bach suite from memory before going to bed every night. This isn't practicing, it's contemplating, he said. You're alone with your soul. Now, where did Yo-Yo Ma get the habit of doing this every night? From his father. The father of cellist Yo-Yo Ma, you see, spent World War II in Paris, where he lived alone in a garret throughout the German occupation. In order to restore sanity to his world, he, Yo-Yo Ma's father, would practice violin pieces by Bach during the day, and at night, during blackout hours, he would play them alone in the dark. The sound of those strings reverberating was a way of creating beauty, a way of maintaining hope during a dark and dangerous time. Now, why do I want you to think about darkness this morning? Because here we are, first Sunday of the new year, and we just heard a story about light. A familiar story, right? About a beautiful and dazzling star that leads wise men from the east to Jesus. We call this the story of Epiphany, a story of illumination, a story of how Jesus came to be a light even to the Gentiles, even to folks like you and me. It is, to be sure, a story of light, but let's not forget, according to Matthew, that light is surrounded by darkness. In the time of King Herod, that's how our story begins, and whether Herod is trying to trick the wise men, as he does in today's text, or whether he wants to hunt down Jesus, as we learn in verse 13, or whether Herod is busy slaughtering all children under the age of 3, as we learn in verse 16, there is enough darkness in our text for today to rival anything that happens in our world right now. So why does Matthew do this? Why does Matthew talk about this light and this darkness? Well, Matthew wrote this chapter in his gospel, and he was recalling the words of Isaiah, the words that we heard just a few moments ago in our Old Testament reading. Darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Epiphany is a story of light in the midst of darkness. But before we get to the light, I think it would do well for us to explore the darkness just a little bit more. You see, darkness can take many forms. There is the darkness of the Herods of the world, those who live in opposition to the love and grace of God. And then there's the darkness that we sometimes find within ourselves. Darkness that exists within people like you and me who want to share the love of God. Do you remember when those letters that Mother Teresa wrote were revealed to the public all those years ago? Do you recall what she said about her own spiritual state? Please pray for me, she wrote, that it may please God to lift this darkness from my soul. Even Mother Teresa knew something about the darkness. You see, sometimes darkness is not simply a beautiful thing or even a fearful thing. Sometimes darkness is an overwhelming thing. If you have ever fought the demons of depression or addiction, you know. If you have ever walked down corridors of grief, you know. If you have ever been helpless to help your own child, you know. You know that one of the most frustrating things about darkness is that many times there's no apparent reason for it. It just is. Look at how the Bible begins. Opening words of Genesis. In the beginning, the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. Where does that darkness come from? The Bible doesn't say. We don't know. We don't know. In August of 1949, 15 U.S. airborne firefighters, the smoke jumpers, jumped into the sky in the Montana wilderness in order to fight the Man Gulch fire. Within an hour, all but 3 of them were dead or mortally burned. Norman Maclean reconstructed the events of that day in his fine book, Young Men and Fire. Maclean tried to understand what happened, why it happened, and how to make sure that such a thing never happened again. What Maclean found, however, through all his searching, was incomplete. There remained unsolved riddles and half-understood actions. Not so, he observed, about the movie that was made 3 years after the fire. In the movie, lessons are clear, and the foreman saves his boys in the next fire so that everyone lives happily ever after. Commenting on the film, Maclean writes, "Here is this movie that has attained some kind of immortality by easily adding to small broken pieces of truth. Our story, the one he wrote about the Man Gulch fire, is hard on itself," he says, "by trying to find its true ending." Perhaps, he goes on, this is a reminder to keep open the possibility that there is no real ending to the Man Gulch fire. If so, then let it be so. There's a lot of tragedy in the universe, Maclean writes, that has missing parts and comes to no conclusion. I think the gospel writer Matthew would agree with Norman Maclean. There is plenty of tragedy in the universe without answers, plenty of darkness without explanation, and it does no good for us to dress up our lives like the movie version of events. That's one reason why Matthew gives us the story of the wise men and Herod, to say that the darkness is real, to say that God's love and light always face opposition, that the forces of chaos and sin are vigilant about trying to extinguish the light. But in the end, I think Matthew takes us in a different direction than Norman Maclean. Matthew tells us there is a conclusion, a point, a message, and that message can be found in the gifts of the wise men. Look again at the gifts that the wise men brought. You remember the gifts the wise men brought, right? I got tempted to call on somebody to see if you remembered the gifts the wise men brought. I can see the freaked out look in your faces right now. I will not do that. It was what? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. That's right, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Those gifts are an echo of Isaiah 60, what we heard in the Old Testament reading. Or I should say, almost an echo. Do you recall what gifts are mentioned in the Isaiah passage? Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall proclaim the praise of the Lord. Gold and frankincense. What gift is not found in Isaiah? Myrrh. The wise men brought myrrh, but in Isaiah there is no myrrh. Why would the wise men bring myrrh? Well, what was myrrh used for back in Jesus' day? One of the uses for myrrh was embalming. Embalming. It was used on the occasion of a funeral. Look, this is supposed to get our attention. Show of hands. How many of you have ever been to a baby shower before? Show of hands. Good. How many of you brought a gift when you went to that baby shower? Good. How many of you, when you were searching for that gift, thought, you know what? The perfect gift for this child would be some embalming ointment? No, of course not. But that's what the wise men did. The wise men showed up after Jesus' birth, prepared for Jesus' funeral. Now, why would they do that? Let me get at it like this. Let's go back to Norman Maclean for a second. McLean wrote his book, Young Men and Fire, in part to help prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. And when McLean died in 1990, it looked like he had succeeded. But the terrible irony of the story is that 4 years after McLean's death, another tragedy like that first one occurred in Colorado. And McLean's son, John, a reporter, chronicled those events in a book of his own. Taken together, these two books, I think, are a testimony to the truth that Matthew wants us to see. No matter how hard we work, no matter how good our intentions are, we cannot save ourselves. No matter how much we love other people, no matter how many gifts we give to other people, we cannot save ourselves. When the wise men bring myrrh at the beginning of Jesus' story, they are pointing us to the end of Jesus' story, to the reality that not even Jesus, not even God's chosen Messiah, had the power to save himself. At the end of his life, when he was hanging on the cross, do you remember what those who saw him said? You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. He saved others. He cannot save himself. And they were right. Jesus could not save himself. Jesus placed his life entirely in the hands of God, because only God could save Jesus, and only God can save you and me. Of course, it wasn't just after Jesus died that God intervened in his life. God was continually saving Jesus, even when he was very young. How did the wise men know not to return to Herod? God told them in a dream. How did Joseph know to get out of town and flee to Egypt? God came to him in a dream. God was continually coming to save Jesus, just like God comes again and again to rescue you and me. You see, the other side, the flip side of we cannot save ourselves is this: God still saves us. Do you believe that? Do you believe that God still saves us? I think you know what that means. When old wounds with a loved one are mended, you know. When hope is found in the midst of despair, you know. When prayers are answered, when you are surprised by a moment of unspeakable grace in your life, you know. You know the truth that you could not give those gifts to yourself, that the one who created you gave them to you, and that same one has promised to never leave you. I don't think the story of the wise men is as much a nativity story as it is a resurrection story, a new life story, a story of a God who promises to show up in our lives again and again to save us, sometimes in unexpected ways. The Presbyterian pastor, the Reverend Dr. Scott Black Johnston, tells about when his father died a number of years ago. Scott was serving a church in Atlanta at the time. He went back to the small town of Mora, Minnesota for the funeral. He describes being in the funeral home with his dad lying there in the coffin, and he's trying to make small talk with all these old family friends. My mind was reeling with the kind of crazy mixture of emotions that being in the presence of a dead loved one seems to bring on, he writes. I wasn't sure whether I could stand being in that space much longer, and yet I knew it was where I needed to be. Well, at that moment, he says, 2 people walked into the funeral home. He recognized them. But they weren't from Minnesota. They weren't from his childhood. They were members of his church in Atlanta, and they were completely unexpected. God does not fax salvation in from some suite in heaven's ritzy district, Scott writes. God comes. God incarnates. God steps out of grandeur to stand with us in awkward places at awful times to experience life and death. Of the appearance of his two friends from Atlanta, Scott says, "It is impossible to describe the power of that moment." One part of his mind, when he looked at them, said, "They don't belong here." And then he realized, yes, that's right where they belong. They were carriers of God's light, messengers of God's love. Let me invite you to consider your relationship with the darkness this morning. Is it something you try to avoid? If you're like me, the answer is often yes. And yet, Matthew reminds us today that as followers of Jesus, the darkness is often where you and I belong. So we too can share God's light. So we too can spread God's love. Don't go through this next year trying to fix people or trying to save people. Just find some darkness. Be a light. And let God do the saving. Amen.